Robert Dahl is, as I said, a very well-respected political scientist who's been writing for 4 or 5 decades now. Before we talk about what's in the book, I want to go back and talk about 2 different lists I gave you early in the semester. I said that when we're doing our best work, trying to understand the world around us, we're often at the same time trying to think philosophically, historically, and sociologically. I suggested that in any class or in any inquiry you're involved in, it's always good to think philosophically, to think about principles that could be universalized. Principles that don't just apply to me or you, but are principles we could in good faith try to argue should be universal. Right? Is Robert Dahl's book philosophical in that sense? Yeah, he's trying to get at democratic principles that he thinks and others think can be universalized. It doesn't mean that they're going to play out the exact same way in every culture. But it's that search for principles that can be defended across the board. Is this book historical? Sure. He's looking back at history, at democratic forms of governance, trying to learn from them, trying to bring together different kinds of governments throughout history to help us understand how to make democracy work. Is the book sociological? Does it look at the existing distributions of wealth and power to try and puzzle through how to make us a more democratic society? Sure, that's a lot of what he's talking about too. So this book is a great example of someone thinking philosophically, historically, and sociologically all at the same time. The fact that these are different disciplines in the university. You take a philosophy class, you take a history class, you take a sociology class, leads us to believe that we compartmentalize. But this is a great example of why we should not compartmentalize. If we want to understand a complex concept like democracy, we have to think at all these levels all the time. Another list of 3 I gave you at the beginning of the semester: empirical, analytical, and normative. Let's review that. Empirical, evidence, trying to look at the world and collect data. Is there empirical material in the Dahl book? Sure, he's gathering evidence. Is there analytical material? Is he taking that evidence and trying to make sense of how the world works? Sure. And are there normative claims? Are there times when Dahl doesn't just say, this is what is, or this is how it works, but this is what should be? Normative claims are claims about the way the world should work. Yeah, of course. So again, trying to highlight the fact that when we look at good work, it's always working empirically, analytically, and normatively. It's looking at the world. You can't just make stuff up. You've got to look at the world and see how things really are. And then you have to take all of that data and try to make sense of how the world works. You have to not just collect data, you have to analyze. And then, if you want to be, a moral agent, if you want to be part of contemporary politics, at some point you have to say what you believe should be. So Dahl is both reviewing the data on democracies, analyzing what makes democracy work, and at various places articulating his vision of what democracy should look like. Now, that said, let me make one more point about sort of the way we talk in academic life. Polyarchy. There's an important concept in this book, yes? Polyarchy. Polyarchy. What is polyarchy? I remember when I first read this book, or first, I don't know where I first stumbled on the term, I was a little nervous, because when I first read polyarchy, I didn't have a clue about what it meant. Did anybody else have that experience? You bump into this term, polyarchy. I'd heard of oligarchy. We know what oligarchy is, right? Oligarchy is the rule by the few. But polyarchy, which in its root, of course, is just the rule by the many, what does that mean? I didn't know. And the first time I bumped into polyarchy and I didn't know what it meant, you know how I felt? I felt dumb. I felt dumb. I felt everybody must know what this means, yes? Beyond the root word, rule by many. But I didn't know. So I felt dumb. And then I realized, you know what? Polyarchy, it's a word Robert Dahl made up. He just made it up. It's not something, it's not, words don't fall from the sky, with inherent meanings. He made the damn word up. And it's not so complicated. And then I laughed at myself because I fell into the trap of, again, I'm going to use some rough language here, but I don't know any other way to say it, okay? I fell into the trap of believing the bullshit that professors make up. Very, very dangerous. Don't do that. This is a trade secret. Professors make stuff up. I don't mean we lie. We make terms up to describe things. You know why we do that? Because we think it makes us look smart. So instead of just using ordinary words to talk about the world, we like to make up new words because we like to look smart. Now, don't blame us, because we get paid money to look like we're smart, correct? What do you pay professors for? You pay them to appear to be smart. And if making up new words every once in a while and confusing you leads to you feeling dumb, all the better. Because if you feel dumb, who do you need to rise out of that ignorance? You need me. And that means you better keep paying me to be smart. And what's the evidence that I'm smart? I made up a word that you didn't understand. There's a technical term for that. It's called a scam. You're being scammed. All right. Now, I say that sort of jokingly, but not completely. I don't think Robert Dahl's trying to scam anybody. I think Robert Dahl wanted to have a term that would describe his vision of a democracy, so he made up this word polyarchy, playing off those root words, and it's okay. But I do think it's an important lesson that a lot of what goes on in academic life is making up terms and complex theories, sometimes to describe things that are pretty plain. And the reason that happens is because there's an incentive in academic life for people like me to make things up that make us look smart. It doesn't mean that some of what professors come to understand and put new terms to isn't really important. I don't want you to take this to mean that I think all of academic work is irrelevant or pompous. It's not. Some of it's very, very important. But if you ever find yourself reading academic work and wondering whether the writer really needed to use all of these terms or all of this dense language, you have a right to say, why? Why did you have to make up words? Why did you have to write in ways that seem impenetrable to me, someone who's literate and reasonably intelligent? You have a right to make that claim. But because polyarchy is important to the way he talks about this, let's review it. If you have your book with you or you want to make a note, the little footnote he offers is on page 90. Polyarchy is derived from Greek words meaning many and rule, thus rule by the many, distinguished from oligarchy, rule by the few. And he explains, what I like about Dahl is he explains, he says, listen, a colleague and I made this up. 1953, we just made it up, right? He doesn't say made it up. He says introduced the term, which is a way of saying we made it up. We introduced it. All right. Now, what is a polyarchy? If you go back to page 85, 86, the political institutions of modern representative democracy, there it is. It's very straightforward. There's nothing complicated about this. Polyarchy is simply a word that Dahl and a colleague introduced, that is to say, made up, to describe a society in which these 6 political institutions are present. A polyarchy is a society that has elected officials, that has free, fair, and frequent elections, that has freedom of expression, that has access to alternative sources of information, to associational autonomy, freedom of association, and inclusive citizenship. The idea that all competent adults are part of the polity, are citizens. That's all polyarchy means. So don't stumble over words. If you don't understand a word, make sure you do understand what it means. It's easy when you run into words that seem technical and kind of abstract, to just gloss over them. If you find yourself bumping up against a word you don't understand, try and understand what it means. So, another point I want to make, political equality. He talks a lot about political equality, yes? What does that mean? A lot of what Dahl's writing about is, he's not just making up terms for things. Most of what he's writing about is using terms that we're very familiar with. Equality. That's a good thing, yes? How many of you are for equality? Everybody, come on, raise your hand. Everybody's for equality. But what does it mean? To have a democratic society, we all understand at some level, is something, it involves equality. But what does that equality mean? Does it mean that everybody has access to exactly the same education? Well, if that's it, then we don't have equality in this country. Does it mean everybody has access to the same wealth? Well, if that's what it means, we don't have equality in this country. So what does equality mean? So a lot of what Dahl is doing is not just making up new words, but he's taking the words we use routinely and trying to ask, what do we really mean by them? What are the core elements of something like political equality? All right. On page 37, under the heading Criteria for a Democratic Process, he talks about things: effective participation, voting equality, enlightened understanding, control of the agenda, inclusion of adults. What is democracy? That's the question we're keep wrestling with. There it is, right on page 38. You're asking yourself, what is democracy? Just go to page 38. It's right there. Effective participation, equality in voting, gaining enlightened understanding, exercising final control of the agenda, inclusion of adults. There. Why did it take us a month? Could have just read page 38. There it is. But of course, we don't understand what equality is from a list. We have to wrestle with what those terms mean. And since there is no society in which these lists that Dahl offers us are achieved fully, there is no society, this or any other, including Norway. Even Norway doesn't have it down completely. Right? That we're always struggling to. So what levels of effective participation, equality in voting, gaining enlightened understanding, etc., what levels of those are necessary for us to think of ourselves as a real democracy? Right? And those are not easy questions. Let's take one of them, equality in voting. We know that up until very recently, that was a major flaw in American democracy, yes? That although the Civil War and the post-Civil War amendments to the U.S. Constitution technically enfranchised a formerly enslaved population, we know perfectly well that people of African descent were routinely denied the right to vote up until the 1960s, correct? So we didn't have equality in voting, did we? So we weren't really a meaningful democracy through that period of what we now commonly call Jim Crow segregation. That throughout the American South, even in some places in the North, but particularly in the American South, an entire group of people were systematically excluded from voting. If voting is one of the benchmarks of democracy, we weren't a democracy in any meaningful sense. Legislation, Voting Rights Act, in combination with the Civil Rights Act, was an attempt to address that. And now we have, at least for the most part, fully enfranchised the adult population of the United States, correct? Well, sort of, except there are states in the United States where you cannot vote if you're in prison. If you're in prison, you can't vote. Well, those are adults, competent adults, but they're not allowed to vote because they're in prison. So do we have equality in voting? Not if you consider the fact that we disenfranchise people currently incarcerated. In some states, it's not only if you're incarcerated, if you're a convicted felon, if you've been convicted of a felony, you cannot vote for the rest of your life. Is that consistent with democracy? Do we have democracy? Do we meet the criteria of equality in voting if in fact we disenfranchise a segment of our population? Is there an argument that can be made that when you've committed a felony, excuse me, that you have forfeited the right to vote? Well, people make the argument. Obviously, we have those laws in some states. But is that a good argument? Should having committed a felony, if one of you, let's say, were to be down on your luck, a little short of cash, and you end up dealing non-prescription chemicals to make a little money to pay your tuition, it could happen in this room. There might be somebody faced with that, right? In fact, there might be somebody here currently engaged in that occupation, yes? How many of you are currently dealing any illegal substances on a regular basis, making a significant living from dealing? Oh, okay. Well, let's hypothetically, if you were and you got busted and convicted of a felony, should you be deprived of your right to vote? Well, that's an interesting question. My point is that the list matters. To identify those criteria of a democracy is a good thing to do. It helps us organize our thinking, but it doesn't end the conversation. Right? And it's in my experience that when you make advances on some element of democracy, right, when you fully enfranchise the population, including those who'd previously been disenfranchised, what that does is open up new questions. That if democracy means anything, it means never being satisfied with what you have. That what democracy means is always struggling. And I think that we know this from personal experience. Let's say you have a problem in your own life, and you work on it, and you get better at something. Does that mean you can sit back and say, the rest of my life, I'm golden, right? I got everything figured out? No, what happens is when we deal with our flaws personally, that inevitably all that does is open up a kind of new way to see other things on which we fall short. And to be a decent person is to always be struggling to be a better person. If somebody came up to you and said, "Hi, I'm Bob, I'd like to be your friend, and I think the reason you should be my friend is because I've dealt with all my own flaws, and for the next 30 years of my life, I expect to live a pretty much perfect life." If somebody introduced themselves to you that way, would you immediately rush to be their friend? No, you'd say, "Who's this delusional asshole? What's this guy what's he trying to sell me? The guy's a nut." And what is true of us individually, I think, is true of us collectively. That when we stop and say, we've got it all figured out, what we're doing is essentially missing all of the things that we need to be working on. So